Let me introduce you to somebody who's in the cathedral. She's been a good wife and a good mother. She has given her life for her serving her children. She still spends a fair deal of time and money on her children, supporting them. She's been very active in the church, teaching Sunday school, cleaning the brass, and whenever cakes are needed, she brings them in. She's a good woman. She's participating in the service wholeheartedly, and she knows she's a good singer. Perhaps only distracted by a man who is also in the service who just doesn't seem to know how to behave in church. The man is sitting towards the back. He has not been a good husband, and it's well known that he cheated on his wife, leading to the loss of many friends as well as a disastrous set of relationships with his children. His business has done okay, but being a bookie, he knows that it's a bit shady, and the money he has made has been out of the misery of others. There have been so many mistakes, so many things wrong, and there is no way he can put them right. Ashamed with his own sense of guilt, he's unable to join in the service. He sits at the back, occasionally crying. He prays that God would have mercy on him. And before the service is over, he slinks out the back. The woman watches him go and thinks it's probably for the best. It's good that he's gone. She knows what kind of man he is. And Jesus says, it is the man who goes home right with God and not the woman. This is the shock of this well-known story. It is those who are humble, who are justified, who are put right, who are accepted by God. It is a story then of hope for the humble, but it's a challenge because there is hope only for the humble. Those who do not recognise their need do not find acceptance with God. In other words, there is both hope here, but there is also a challenge. Will we be humble enough to hear it and humble ourselves before God? Luke, as he recounts this well-known story, does something that preachers are kind of told not to do. He applies it straight away just to make sure that we get what this story is about. There is no doubt at the meaning. It is aimed at those who trust in themselves rather than in God, those who believe themselves to be righteous. Now, that means more than just good, okay? Not just being a good person. It means they're acceptable to God. They are okay with God. They are in the right with him, and because they are in the right with God, they treat others with contempt. A high view of themselves leads to a low view of others. Now, given the way the story is told, Jesus is clearly aiming at some of the Pharisees. I don't think we could say all the Pharisees thought like this, but he's having a go particularly at the religious elite. Now, we're so used to this story and we're so used to the idea of the Pharisees being the bad guys that we need to remember that this would have been a complete shock to those who first heard the story. The Pharisees were the good guys. They were the righteous one. They were the really good religious people. They did pray. They knew it. Everybody knew they prayed because they did it publicly. You could see them praying. They were moral and they fasted. They strictly fasted more than was strictly necessary. They gave fastidiously 10% of their income. You couldn't do better than to be a Pharisee. Clearly you were in the right with God. But what Jesus is teaching here is that it's not being a good guy that gets you on the right with God. It is not our goodness, but the goodness of God that is what matters. Not our goodness, but the goodness of God that what matters. Now, the tax collectors were definitely not seen to be the good guys. They were collaborators with the occupying Roman forces. And rather than giving away 10% of their income, they were sort of putting at least 10% onto the taxes for a little bit of skimming off the top for themselves. It's no surprise that unlike the Pharisee who's there in the centre of the religious action, the tax collector is off by himself. No one would have wanted to be near him. He was a moral leper. and he knew it. He was on the outside of God's people. He was clearly a sinner. He did the wrong things. But it is because of that knowledge, because he understood that he needs God's mercy, that he receives it. That he goes home right with God, not the Pharisee. As Jesus says, those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. There is true hope here for the humble. It's a beautiful, wonderful statement to know that we can leave this place right with God. But there's also a warning. This hope only comes through humility. If we don't recognise it, we don't get it. We need to hear both parts of what Jesus says. Now, of course, being human, the tragic and ironic sort of reaction to this story is to think, well, thank God I'm not like the Pharisee. Immediately showing that we're exactly like the Pharisee. We need to think clearly about how to apply this passage to our own lives. Now, the Pharisee, of course, is a bit of a cliche. I can't imagine there was anybody who starts a prayer with, thank God I'm not like them. But you can see what Jesus is doing. And actually, if you look at the prayer, it's actually not a prayer, is it? It might start with the word God, but from then on it becomes completely focused on himself. In fact, it's translated here, he was praying by himself. It could be translated, he was praying about himself. In fact, I think more likely it could be translated, he prayed to himself. All of those are possible translations of the Greek. You don't need to play around with the Greek to know it's all about him. It starts with God, then there are 5 references to himself. I, my. It's all about him. It sort of feels like a presidential tweet, self-congratulatory and judgmental of others and full of capital letters. He doesn't actually ask for anything, let alone praying for forgiveness and mercy, because he doesn't ask, he doesn't get. If you don't ask, you don't get, right? He doesn't feel he needs it. It is utterly self-obsessed. Now you might think, well, I'd never pray like that. But just for a second, think about how you do pray. How many I's and me's and my's are in your prayers? How focused are your prayers actually on you? But rather than praying to God, you're praying about yourself. I find it very hard to not be self-absorbed. I don't know why I put that in that double negative. I find it very easy to be self-absorbed. And if I could be bothered thinking about you, I suspect you'd be the same. See, the Pharisee wasn't self-critical, but he's certainly critical, because what's one of the best ways to make yourself feel better? One of the easiest ways to make us feel better is to put other people down. We may not pray, I thank you that I'm not like other people, but it's so easy to think it. Whether that be other people in our world, other people in our community, or really sadly, other Christians, even other people in our church community. See, but if we're judging others, if we're putting them down, if we're being critical of them, we're encouraging God to do the same to us. Jesus, of course, teaches, judge not that you not be judged. We know this, but we live in a culture which encourages us to be judgmental as it pushes us into tribalism. It's not about them, it's about us. And trolling. I did this at 8 o'clock and I'm still not sure how to pronounce it. If they're trolls, presumably it's trolling. If it's supposed to be trolling, I apologise. You may not even be able to hear the difference. You could put a comment on our Facebook page about the Dean doesn't even know how to say trolling. How are we to avoid being like the Pharisee? How are we to be people who can embrace humbleness or humility? Well, there's a hint in the tax collector's prayer. Like the Pharisee, he addresses God, but he keeps his focus there. He immediately makes his plea. For he knows he comes before a holy God and he knows that he doesn't stack up. He's not comparing himself with the Pharisee. He's bringing himself before God. The way to appropriate humility is not to compare yourselves with others, but to bring yourself honestly and truly before our Creator and our Maker. The famous Bible commentator William Barclay spoke of a train journey he made from Scotland south down into Yorkshire. On his way down into Yorkshire, he noticed a whitewashed house that in the sun shone with a brilliant whiteness in the midst of the moors. A few days later, as he made his way back north up to Scotland, it had snowed, and the whole of the area was now covered in brilliant white snow. And he's looked out that house which had seemed so bright, which had seemed so luminous, which had seemed so radiant, was now drab and soiled and grey. The issue is, what are we comparing ourselves to? If we compare ourselves to others, it's pretty easy to find somebody who will make you feel good. But as soon as you start comparing yourself to God, His holiness, and what we see in our Lord Jesus Christ who reveals God to us, our only response can be, have mercy on me, a sinner. This is memorably put in the prayer of humble access, which we're going to say later in this service. We are not so worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under your table. Now, I often think, what are you lot thinking as you're saying that? Because I reckon someone's thinking, do you know, I reckon I might be worthy to get a crumb, at least a bit. But remember, it's not my table, it's not the cathedral's table, it's the Lord's table. The issue is not comparison with each other's, but comparison and putting ourselves before God. And further, touched this a few times, but remember, God knows all about us. See, we've seen this week secrets at the highest level of the US government being exposed. Things that people thought were private have been let out and they're in the public domain. They're all over the web. But God is the ultimate revealer of secrets, not because he's accidentally been linked into a private conversation, but because he is the one before whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hidden. As we heard in our 1 Samuel reading, talk no more so very proudly, let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. We don't base it against our own view of what's right, but against God's. Looking to God and not to ourselves is the path to humility, and humility is the path to mercy, forgiveness, and being right with God. And we can know that we will be right with God because his nature is always to have mercy. But if we're not looking for it, we won't get it. We should also recognise that in doing this, of course, humbling ourselves will give us hope for changing our judgmental ways. Because we'll realise that we have been put right with God not because of anything we have done, but simply as a matter of grace. And once we've understood that, it will change the way that we look at others. See, if we're always looking to ourselves to show that we're good enough, we'll always be judging others. But if we know it's grace, it will change how we think of ourselves. We are right with God. We are loved by him. We are forgiven by him because of who he is. And that will change how we think and act towards others. Where we are tempted to judge, we should be thinking there, but for the grace of God, go I. And so we will act with grace towards them and show grace to them. And the really niggly bit about this is, if you're not treating people with grace, does that mean you've never actually understood God's grace to you? That you've never truly humbled yourself before God and known the grace that he can bring? This short little passage ends with a final challenge, with Jesus repeating a teaching that he's shown elsewhere or taught elsewhere, and we see it throughout the scriptures. And of course, it's actually lived out by Jesus. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how Paul, when he talks about exalting yourself, talks about being puffed up. And I was also thinking about the passage which follows about being childlike. And it made me start thinking about balloons. Now, I gave this a crack at 8 o'clock, and I'm not sure it was a screaming success, but we'll give it another try. So, if we come to God filled with our own thoughts and trusting in our own goodness, we puff ourselves up. I'm a good person. I'm better than that person. I'm definitely better than that lot out there. Now, just so we're clear, one of the other ways that you can puff yourself up weirdly is by having a very low view of yourself. By thinking, oh, I'm worse than everybody else. Nobody has a life that's as hard as me. All of that is focusing on yourself and is a weird reverse way of exalting yourself. Do you hear what I'm doing? I hope you can see what I'm doing. Hopefully you can't hear what the balloon is doing. I'll keep that away from the microphone. Okay, when you do this, and you keep doing that, problem is when you then come before God, there's no room for God to put anything in. It's all full. It's full of yourself. It's full of all the things you're thinking about, and eventually God will just let you go. I was really hoping that would go further that way, at least as far as Bob. It didn't quite get there, although it did work better than at 8 o'clock. Now, but if we come to God like this, humble, recognizing what we need, then God can speak good things into our life. God can say to us, you have mercy. You are loved. You are forgiven. You are my child. You have my spirit. You are called into my service. You have a future with me. And I will never leave you, or I will never forsake you. And then rather than being filled with ourselves, we're filled with the truth of God. And we are exalted by him as his children. Now this is the bit that's a bit tricky. Now, I don't know whether this is going to be picked up on the video, but this is a Jesus All About Life balloon, which I found at home. Which is just as well, because this one's a Father Christmas one, which is rather less useful. But you see, if we are filled with what God has filled us with, then rather than being humbled, we can really fly. Don't hit the... Okay, that again was supposed to float out across you lot, but I hope it's made the point. If we exalt ourselves, we will flame out. But if we trust in what God says, if we humble ourselves before him and hear that Jesus says to us, you can leave here knowing you are right with God, then we can truly fly. And we can go knowing there in the grace of God go I. Amen.